Happy Doctors Day. Thank you for all that you're doing for the department, the hospital, your patients. It's greatly appreciated. And there's free breakfast if you're in the hospital and lunch. Dr. Chevenak had to go to the medical school, so he couldn't be with us this morning, but he's very sorry to not be able to participate in this talk.
Hi, Professor Adashi.
Hello, Tom. How you doing?
Alan, everything is good. You look great.
Good to see you.
You too. How's Rhode Island?
Well behaved for the most part, with a few exceptions.
Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. Good morning. If everybody can mute their devices, that would be great, so we don't have background noise. We'll have an opportunity to do questions at the end, or you can send them in to the message. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Dr. Eli Adashi today. He is an amazing physician and scientist and researcher. He has won every possible award and has been member of every society, including the National Academy of Medicine, the New York Academy of Science, and many more. He is the former dean of Brown University, and I'm gonna let him talk about the present and future of IVF. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Adi. I was looking at my calendar. It seems like the last time I visited Lennox Hill was in 2015. So unlike most of you, I haven't been getting younger. So 7 years ago, I guess we must have met. Very different administration, of course. I also, before I start, want to apologize to those of you who attended the last year's meeting of the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, in that I delivered a similar presentation there. So those of you who were there may be in for a partial repeat. And to those, I apologize. But it's a story that, if I may say so, is worth repeating, because that only happens once in a lifetime. So to begin with, I will note that at least in the United States, and that was last year, we were recognizing and celebrating the 40th anniversary of the birth of the first American IVF baby, whose name was Elizabeth Jordan Carr, who at the time was, of course, the very first we produced 3 years after the British have accomplished this feat. Elizabeth was featured on virtually every newspaper outlet in the country, be it the Boston Globe, all the way to Life magazine. Interestingly, though, and that's not widely recognized, the story of IVF in the United States, and for that matter worldwide, really dates back to 1965, when a young Bob Edwards came to the United States, specifically to Johns Hopkins, to work with Doctors Howard and Georgiana Jones, on the possibility of recovering human oocytes, culturing them, maturing them, and fertilizing them in vitro, of course, with an eye towards eventually creating an IVF program. For reasons that are not entirely clear to me, he was having trouble securing human oocytes in the UK, which prompted his visit to the United States, wherein he spent a year. At the conclusion of that effort, which relied mostly on oocytes that were derived from resected ovarian wedges that were carried out on polycystic ovary patients who underwent ovarian wedge resection, the group published a paper in the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology, the conclusions of which were largely negative, meaning they stated that in their judgment, they failed to fertilize the human oocytes that they were working with at the time. In hindsight, a review of some of the images and some of the criteria that were used to determine fertilization suggest that they may, in fact, have been successful, even though they may not have recognized it at the time. And so, if that is in fact the case, you could argue that the first in vitro fertilization of a human egg transpired in the United States back in 1965. By 1978, after 35 years of service, Doctors Howard and Georgiana Jones, who are the main protagonists, of course, of this story, retired, quote unquote, and proceeded to relocate to Norfolk, Virginia. However, something happened on the way to Norfolk. And that something occurred on July the 25th, 1978. And that, of course, was the birth of Louise Joy Brown, shown here in the arms of her mother, Leslie. And that, in essence, changed everything, because all of a sudden, Doctors Howard and Georgiana Jones found a new challenge that they wanted to tackle.
And then we came to Norfolk.
And that happened to be the birthday of Louise Brown.
The story captured the world's headlines, and the Joneses had a link with the British team of Patrick Steptoe and Robert Edwards. Edwards had worked with them at Baltimore. A Norfolk reporter wanted to talk about it.
She came to our home as the man was moving in the boxes and the furniture, and we had an interview sitting on the boxes. And as she finished the interview, she asked us, could this be done in Norfolk? And we thought it was almost a joke, and we said, why, certainly. And she said, what would it take? And we said, a little money.
What happened?
The most extraordinary thing. Georgiana had had a patient from Norfolk who had come to Baltimore with infertility. She was fortunate to have a child subsequent to that. And she called up Georgiana.
She said, Dr. Jones, I understand that Dr. Howard says that it will only take a little bit of money to bring a test tube baby clinic to Norfolk. And my family has a foundation which we would love to donate.
Well, with money out of the way, the next challenge was to put together a team, and that they did. The team included Dr. Mason Andrews, who was the professor and chair of the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at the Eastern Virginia Medical School at the time, and the future obstetrician of Judy Carr. It also included Dr. Jairo Garcia, a former trainee of Dr. Howard and Georgiana Jones, who joined the team from Colombia. Dr. Howard Jones, his wife Georgiana Jones, and finally Anibal Acosta, also a former trainee of Drs. Howard and Georgiana Jones, who joined the team from Argentina. Last but not least was Ms. Lucinda Wieck, who served as the all-important embryologist of the team. But nothing went very smoothly in that this was a new day and Virginia has its conservative roots. And one of the first obstacles was what was required at the time, and that is the securing of a certificate of need for the hospital to, in fact, conduct in vitro fertilization. And that triggered a battle royale between the pro-life and pro-choice constituencies in the state of Virginia. The pro-life contingent was headed by Charles D. Dean Jr., who was president of the Tidewater chapter of the Virginia Society for Human Life. On the pro-choice side, the program was joined by Roy Parker, MD, who was at the time the chair of obstetrics and gynecology at Duke University, but was also at that moment serving as president of the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology. The team was also joined by Professor John Biggers from Harvard Medical School, by the Right Reverend Heath Light, and by Rabbi Lawrence Foreman. I will spare you the details. Suffice it to say that this was a bitter dispute, at the end of which, nevertheless, a certificate of need was granted to the hospital, and so the IVF program could, in fact, proceed. The early record of the Norfolk IVF program was hardly stellar. The beginning entailed 41 natural IVF cycles with embryo transfer and 12 HMG, human menopausal gonadotropin, stimulated IVF cycles with embryo transfer, 53 attempts in all, but no pregnancies to that point, which is when Judith Carr and her husband, Roger, joined the program. And they, as is already apparent to you, were destined to provide the program with its first success. The egg retrieval of Judith Carr transpired on April the 21st, 1981. The egg fertilized and the embryo transfer took place on April the 27th of 1981. A positive pregnancy test was derived on May the 7th, and a delivery of Elizabeth Jordan Carr was scheduled to take place by cesarean section on December the 28th, 1981. Here are a few scenes, happy scenes, I would say, from that cesarean section right there in the labor and delivery suite.
Elizabeth Jordan Carr.
She was good. That's all I wanted to hear. No, I like your hat. Hello. Beautiful. She's something else. Well, you don't look too thrilled with life, man. Hello. Hello. She is kind of tiny though, isn't she?
She looks well nourished. You can tell by the skin, the quality of the skin, and the thickness of the skin fold.
We'll let her go back to sleep. I think so. Oh dear.
Got the show.
Okay.
Not too long after that, the Joneses, in their inimitable fashion, christened Elizabeth Jordan Carr, their first IVF granddaughter, one of many that, of course, came in her wake. So they referred to her as their first IVF granddaughter. Sometime last year, I had the opportunity to reconnect with Judith Carr and conduct a brief interview with her, which I'd like to show you, during which she recounted her experience and offered a few other insights heretofore unheard. It is really good to see you again, Judy, and to have this opportunity to revisit what happened now 40 years ago. So thinking back to 1981, what were the circumstances that led you to seek out the Norfolk IVF program? And how did you find out about it in the first place?
Well, in 1981, unfortunately, I suffered my third ectopic pregnancy. And after that, I was speaking with the doctor, and he said, well, I don't know if this makes any sense whatsoever, but he had just returned from a conference in Williamsburg where he heard both Dr. Jones speak on IVF. And the doctor said to me, I have no idea, I don't understand anything about this, but you might be interested.
Were you aware of the fact at the time that the Norfolk program had yet to give rise to an IVF baby at that time? And if so, would that really have mattered to the extent that you can speculate on that?
I had absolutely no idea that they did not have a success. I just assumed that they had, certainly because Louise Brown had been born in England, and I knew there had been some other pregnancies. So I just assumed that this was the case for me. When my husband and I discussed it, and we didn't know, and they didn't tell us, we had decided that we had been given this opportunity to do this as a possibility. And we decided that we didn't want to be 40 years old and looking back and saying, I wish we had done this. And it wouldn't have mattered to us at all.
What do you recall of your first encounter with the Norfolk IVF team? You, after all, did not know any of the actors, did you?
Absolutely not. We were coming from Massachusetts, where this technology was still illegal to even investigate at all of the Massachusetts hospitals. The district attorney in Boston had said this was experimentation on an embryo, and that was not allowed. So we headed to Norfolk after having some phone conversations, and we walked into the Norfolk Clinic, which was at Norfolk Medical School. And the minute I opened the door and walked in, I felt incredibly comfortable and said, we're in the right place. Everyone from the reception to Dr. Garcia and the Drs. Jones, Dr. Costa, everyone we met, we knew we felt very, very comfortable.
I'm hardly surprised, but it's a memory and recollection that only you can share. What is your most vivid recollection of your Norfolk experience, if we can call it that, culminating in the eventual delivery of Elizabeth by cesarean section.
Well, I have several vivid memories. All of them were just so wonderful and such a joy at the time. But one of the things that I found remarkable, when I became pregnant with Elizabeth, Dr. Howard Jones found out that I was taking the airport limousine to the hotel and to the clinic. And after he found that out, he decided that he would become the new limousine driver. And he picked me up every time I flew into Norfolk for an appointment. And it's during that time that he and I would have conversations that we really got to understand each other. I got to understand the importance of all this, which I really didn't understand before, and more about them and the protocols and all of that. And Dr. Jones got to know more about me. And I thought that was a remarkable experience. The other experience that I obviously cannot forget before the birth of Elizabeth was the fact that my egg had fertilized and that they were transferring it on my birthday on April 17th. Amazing.
All kinds of amazing coincidences here with critical dates.
Yes.
What might you wish to say to the physicians who make up our audience today, who are practicing IVF 40 years later as a matter of course, some of whom are probably too young to have recalled what we at least experienced in real time?
Well, it's important for doctors to know, and I received this information because I talk to current patients often. And one of the things that comes to mind, and I think it's very important for doctors to understand, that each patient, even though there's incredible standard protocols and there's cryopreservation and all these wonderful technologies, the doctors need to not lose sight of each individual patient, because there is room for flexibility. And as I said, each patient needs to feel like the doctor knows them. And that's that matter of rapport and trust. And if that doesn't happen, the successes probably aren't as great.
Well, very well said. And of course, spoken by somebody who has witnessed it all firsthand. Judy, I can't tell you how delighted I am that we had this opportunity, how privileged I feel to have known you and to be in a position to revisit these momentous events. Thank you very much. So there you have it, all behind us now, and all of us looking into the future. And in the time left, I'd like to share with you some projections, reflections, thoughts about the future of IVF. But as I mentioned to Dr. Katz just before this presentation, even what I will be saying today already pales in comparison with some recent breakthroughs, which put some of these innovations that we prized only a few months ago, put them in a very different light and almost as past history. I will use as a starting point for the discussion of the future a paper by Dr. Howard Jones, who also undertook to identify what he called the 7 roads traveled well and 7 to be traveled more, which was, in a sense, a reflection on the past and the future of IVF. Those of you who detect echoes of Robert Frost, the well-known American poet, are correct in that Mr. Frost, who was Dr. Jones's teacher in college, left a strong impression on him, and he repeatedly referred back to him, and especially to the probably best known poem of Mr. Frost, The Road Not Taken, upon which the title of Dr. Jones's article, of course, was based. The 7 roads to travel more that I will try to do justice to today will include IVF lab on a chip, the so-called trophectoderm window, the notion of remedial germline editing, the all-important concept and really game-changing concept of in vitro gametogenesis, the stunning possibility of same-sex assisted reproduction, the still far removed, but one never knows, notion of ectogenesis, that is to say, the carriage of a pregnancy outside the womb, and ultimately the ongoing effort to identify embryos who are possessive of newborn potential, that is to say, embryos that can be predicted a priori to survive the first trimester and to successfully make it to term. I will take them one at a time and try to do them justice in the time remaining. I will spend relatively little time on IVF lab on a chip, which is because it is a fast approaching frontier that in many ways is already here. There is a concerted effort to render the embryology work in the lab, to render it more efficient, hopefully to render it better, and to therefore assure higher rates of fertilization and development of the possibly most healthy embryos we can imagine. Much of this relies on technology that is already in existence, but in all likelihood will continue to evolve in the next several years. There have been significant suggestions to introduce artificial intelligence into this context. You hear this in almost every field these days, of course. I don't really know that that is presently a reality, nor do I know that this will ultimately make a material difference. But anything and everything we can do to improve the efficacy of the laboratory component of the process is, of course, in the best interest of IVF and in the final analysis of our patients. The trophectoderm window, which is a concept born, I would say, over the last perhaps decade or two, reflects the fact that for the first time, we can actually access the embryo. We can carry out a biopsy of the embryo, specifically at its trophectoderm level, and in principle, subject that tissue to a complete analysis that is limited only by our imagination and by our technology. We could, in principle, characterize every single gene. We could detect any possible mutation, and we could characterize whichever biochemical abnormality we are in a position to, in fact, tackle. And so the notion of the trophectoderm window, and by extension of the biopsy, is really a key element, I think, in the future of IVF, which is already being put to use in the context of PGD, for example, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, and also in the context of other technologies that are being applied with an eye towards identifying the healthy embryo, possibly the healthiest embryo, and most importantly, avoid the transfer of an embryo that we know a priori is unlikely to implant and survive to term and give rise to a healthy child. There is an ongoing debate on the kind of tests that are being used and the reliability thereof, which I will not go into, but I will say that the trophectoderm window remains a very valuable notion. What is key, though, is that when we introduce new technologies that capitalize on this approach, that we do so responsibly and that we provide the necessary defensible evidence that backs up whatever technology we may bring to the table. Last year, we wrote a review in the New England Journal of Medicine that was titled more or less Responsible Innovation and the Importance thereof, sensing that there may be a variety of so-called IVF add-ons that are being introduced, not always with the appropriate amount of scientific backing that give them the kind of credibility that they will actually require. In the United States, we are handicapped to some degree by the fact that the FDA is, and has been for a long time, assuming more or less a hands-off operation when it comes to what is known as laboratory developed tests, or LDTs, which is why all of the tests that we currently use in the context of the trophectoderm window have not been subjected to FDA review, have not been approved or disapproved by the FDA. They have simply not been looked at by the FDA, which is an unusual anomaly which may well change in the next few years. But as we speak, the FDA exercises significant discretion in terms of evaluating so-called LDTs, and therefore the tests that we currently use in IVF have not been subjected to FDA review. So regulation would also have to be responsible, which is to say that IVF is at this point in time in a no man's land and really will only join, shall we say, civilized society in a true fashion when and if these so-called add-on tests are being given the benefit of FDA regulation, which means a review by an expert committee. The idea of remedial germline editing was born only in reality, I would say, or effectively in 2012, when CRISPR, the gene editing enzyme, was introduced. Up to that point, there were other gene editors available, but they were difficult to handle. They were not quite as versatile, but CRISPR changed it all. And that's when the notion of remedial germline editing, at least as an idea, came to the fore. This is not surprising. There are innumerable cases of inborn diseases that are genetic in origin that could, in theory, be corrected and prevented. And so remedial germline editing comes in through the front door because it is everything the Hippocratic imperative expects us to do. However, the technology has yet to be perfected to a point that it is safe and reliable. And so as we speak, it's just an idea. It really should not be practiced or exercised because we are simply not yet in a position to control the process to the degree that is required. On September the 3rd of 2020, a joint committee of the Royal Society and the National Academy of Medicine published a report on this very issue and issued several key recommendations. One is that no attempt should be made to establish a pregnancy with a human embryo that has undergone genome editing. That clinical use of heritable human genome editing should proceed incrementally. That the clinical use of heritable genome editing should be limited to serious monogenic diseases, and that the clinical use of heritable human genome editing must guarantee impeccable editing efficiency, specificity, and uniformity, as well as euploidy and appropriate embryonic development. We know from work of individuals such as Dieter Egli from Columbia in New York that serious complications can transpire these days with the technology that we have available to us. Unrepaired double-strand breaks persist through embryonic mitosis and result in frequent chromosome loss, he says in a Cell paper published 2 years ago. We are talking about off-target effects of CRISPR, which can cause inserts, deletions, and chromosome loss. In other words, the technology at this point is running amok. It's not yet controlled enough to really be put to clinical use. More of the same was reported on April the 9th, 2021 on the pages of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by the group of Kathy Nayakan from London, who reported that further basic research is required to assess the safety of genome editing techniques in human embryos. So in summary, embryo-based, clinically reliable, heritable human editing, genome editing, is at this point unlikely in the foreseeable future, and that gamete-based heritable human genome editing using cultured stem cell-derived eggs or sperm may well prove to be the preferred route forward because of a series of technical considerations, namely the fact that they can be cultured, that multiple culture tubes can in fact be established, and quality assurance can be maintained in a manner which is not feasible when working with isolated human embryos. Which brings us to the remarkable notion of in vitro gametogenesis, which stand to change everything if other things are not going to intercede. Given the time, this will probably be the last future development that I will spend time on, in that I'd like to leave time for questions after that. So in vitro gametogenesis is all about taking a somatic cell of a patient, converting it to a so-called induced pluripotent stem cell, and then guiding that pluripotent stem cell towards a gametogenic fate. In other words, you start with a skin cell or a buccal cell, and you end up with either an oocyte or a sperm. Unthinkable, and yet it's happening. One stunning illustration of that in the rodent transpired in 2016 on the pages of Nature, reflecting the work of Katsuhiko Hayashi from Kyushu University in Japan, who reconstituted in vitro the entire cycle of the mouse female germline. He started with embryonic stem cells or induced pluripotent stem cells, converted them to what is known as primordial germ cell-like cells, then combined them with gonadosomatic cells, and saw the development of primary oocytes, eventually M2 oocytes, a picture of which is shown on the left, which were capable of being fertilized, giving rise to an embryo and a blastocyst, and eventually, upon transfer to surrogate mothers, gave rise to pups. In a word, he reproduced the entire reproductive cycle in vitro, never ever using gametes per se, but rather using stem cells from somatic tissue that he converted ultimately to gametes. We are not quite there yet with the human. The most advanced report of that possibility came from the group of Mitinori Saito in Kyoto University, who reported the generation of human oogonia on the pages of Science back in 2018. In essence, he starts with human primordial germ cell-like cells, combines them, in this case, with somatic cells from another species because we don't really have the human counterpart. And he was able to take the process all the way to oogonia, but not beyond. In other words, we're still not there when it comes to the human, and it will take more work to get us there. The import of this issue is widely recognized. We can conclude that from the fact that in 2021, Science magazine devoted a major spread to a discussion of mammalian in vitro gametogenesis. The same holds true for the New England Journal of Medicine, which this year carried a paper by Mary Herbert and Azim Surani on oocytes that are derived from stem cells. I can tell you that we are working on a 2022 workshop that is supported by the American Society of Reproductive Medicine that will feature in vitro gametogenesis. The date has not yet been set. And we can also perhaps use this opportunity to speculate on the impact of in vitro gametogenesis once it is realized on IVF. If this ever comes to pass, it is at least reasonable to estimate, to predict that IVG will eliminate the need in stimulation and in egg retrieval. Women will not be needed to be given gonadotropins or to have a surgical procedure to retrieve eggs. Instead, they would simply provide a somatic cell, and in the lab, that cell will be converted into an egg. This will also do away, in principle, with gamete donation, age-dependent or otherwise. It will convert IVF, in principle, to a laboratory procedure, and it will still require endometrial preparation and transfer, but it will be a much more simplified, if you will, and largely lab-based procedure. Whether or not it will will provide us with improved affordability and therefore access is a question mark, because we've been there before and those promises are rarely kept. But this also has profound implications to the very future of REI, which currently is understandably focused and centered on IVF. And if stimulation and retrieval become a thing of the past, this will have a significant effect on the very definition of the subspecialty. I, on various occasions, suggested to the leadership of the discipline to give this some thought now rather than later, in that this could have a profound effect on the practice of reproductive endocrinology going forward. Well, with the time being what it is, I'll probably skip the remainder of my presentation, just show you the headlines, if you will, and close so that we have an opportunity to discuss some of these futuristic notions to the extent that you would like to. So thank you very much again for hosting me at Lennox Hill. As I said, it's been 7 years since the last in-person visit, though, and I hope we can have in-person visits before too long again. There is no substitute to the in-person visit, I discovered in the last 2 years. Zoom lectures are very efficient. It saves one travel, saves one hotels, saves one a lot of stuff, but it's hardly the same. And I miss the human interaction. And so I hope we can all meet again in person and hopefully before too long. So thank you very much for your attention. And should there be any questions, Dr. Katz, I would be pleased to take them at this time.
Thank you so much for this talk. I will start off with a question and then open it up to the audience. So being that of advanced maternal age, this news of using a somatic cell is very fascinating. Are they going to be able to modify the somatic cell and take out genetic diseases, we think, prior to creating an embryo?
So, excellent question. I don't expect you to recall, but I put a question mark next to age dependent because stem cells somatic cells and the stem cells we derive from them from an individual who is of advanced age clearly is not going to be the same as that derived from a younger counterpart. And so there may be limitations there that obviously hold true today with conventional IVF and will likely still hold true if and when in vitro gametogenesis becomes a reality. Whether or not we can actually address the shortcomings of aging, if you will, in the somatic cell or the resultant gamete, I think is an open question. That's a whole new question. It's a whole new technology. Right now, I think the presumption is that if in vitro gametogenesis is to become a reality, the preferred subjects would be those who are not in an advanced age group, if at all possible. Which is not to say that anybody will be excluded, because they aren't excluded today. But there will have to be an appreciation of the fact that the success rate may not be the same. So I hope that helps to put this in perspective.
It does, and it brought to mind another question. I apologize to the audience. When my son was born, we saved the cord blood and it's stored. Is that a potential source? Like, let's say when he's 70, he decides to have a baby.
Yes, I would say, assuming the storage conditions are optimal and the state of the cells 70 years later is the same as it was when they were frozen. I'd say in principle or in theory, by all means. I have to say, I sometimes wonder about the impact of freezing on eggs or sperm, even today, let alone cord blood cells. I don't really know that has been studied quite as thoroughly as I sometimes would like to see. I'm hardly an expert in the area, but I have intuitive concerns about this. And once in a blue moon, I say to myself, maybe I should talk to some experts, read up on the subject, and put something in writing. I haven't done that, but I would say, subject to freezing being a steady state that does not change anything in the status of the cells that were originally derived, then yeah, in theory, they should be all useful. But if freezing has some adverse effects that we do or do not fully recognize today, then there will be questions raised.
Professor, you can hear me?
Very much so.
First of all, a comment and a question. You quoted the use of Robert Frost's work, but I must say that your presentation, which combined the humanism of the past with the view of the future, had a poetic resonance all itself. And my compliments to you, Professor.
Thank you so much.
Back to today, with the modern view, the modern use of the analysis of the embryos, the genetic analysis of the embryos, and people seem to be getting dug in. There's scientific data that shows that you don't need to do it, that you can get the same net of healthy babies. There's other data that you have to slog through some extra miscarriages if you don't to achieve that success. Everybody's all riled about the handling of the mosaic embryo. So with your extraordinary breadth of experience, what's your view of the analysis of the genetic analysis of the embryo?
No, thank you for raising that. Taking a broad view of the question, I still feel that this is a remarkably helpful, useful, and eventually, hopefully, safe and effective way to improve the product of conception. Today, as you have alluded to, this area is marred by controversy at multiple levels. I didn't even mention, because it's a more recent addition, but as you know, there are now efforts to predict future disease states in embryos through polygenic trait tracing. And that too has been the subject of significant controversy, but the commercial enterprises that seek to offer this service are already operational. So you have really two fronts here. One is the front that seeks to characterize the embryo and its short-term journey to term and make sure that the embryo is euploid, that the embryo doesn't have major genetic diseases, etc. And in parallel, there is a whole new technology of polygenic trait prediction that is used in adults, of course, that is intended to predict whether the embryo in question will 50 years hence come down with heart disease or Alzheimer's disease or whatever else. And the parents are, of course, being told that this is another way for them to assure or maximize the quality of their offspring. I think these are all well-meant, or shall we say, well-reasoned ideas, although there is a commercial drive behind all of them. But in principle, they are sound if they are properly carried out, carefully analyzed, and really rise to the scientific criteria that we ask of any technology in whatever field. So what you're seeing now, I think, is a stew, is a vibrant, unsettled environment, all of which relies on the trophectoderm window I mentioned earlier, that is marred in some controversy, and the future of which I would say is still being forged. I am for moving forward and capitalizing on some of these opportunities, but as I said earlier, do it in a responsible fashion. And that's the call we tried to emphasize in the New England Journal paper last year. So I hope that gives you some sense of where somebody like myself at least comes down on the issue. Others may feel very differently, but I don't dismiss the possibilities and the opportunities and the capabilities. What I think I'm concerned about is the rigor of the approach that is currently being applied. And while I don't try not to get into the nitty-gritty of the controversy most of the time, I think there is a future there, but there's also work to be done to get there.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any other questions before we log off?
I would like to add something, Eddie Miklos thought. How are you? Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, sir. It's a wonderful lecture. You know, Judy Carr had 2 ectopic pregnancies in her history. Now, this is one of the diseases that most likely caused by a silent low-grade endometrial infection or pelvic inflammatory disease. And we did a study actually many years ago showing that women's endometrium with ectopic pregnancy harbored chlamydia antigenic material in 40% of the cases. So had she come to you today, what would you do to in the case of assuring that all the infectious components are ruled out?
I suspect, I mean, I don't personally practice IVF, but my colleagues tell me that they go through an extensive battery to rule out any one of these potential pathogens. And that's simply part of the admission battery. I think this is an important point. It's a real concern. And the very fact that you end up in IVF in some cases due to an anatomic pathology already suggests that some infectious process transpired in the past. So yes, I suspect that that is something, I mean, I would agree that this is something that needs to be dealt with right from the beginning, and I'm sure it is. Dr. Singer, who is actively practicing IVF specialist, can probably comment on that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, Miklos, definitely we're doing a routine workup with the help of the OBGYNs. We're doing routine cervical cultures, not to the extent that I think Miklos is referring to, because I know his passion with the uroplasma and mycoplasma and other bacteria that has been shown to be maybe less important in the implantation phase. But you both are right. It's part of the battery for admission for IVF, and the extent can change from practice to practice.
Okay, good practice.
Okay, I would like to thank you all for participating this morning. Happy Doctor's Day and have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you, Adi.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.